The black belt master decided to play a prank on the elderly newcomer in the gym and put him in a tight chokehold. He didn't know that he was facing Chuck Norris himself. Subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching us from? Write in the comments. The mornings on the ranch always came softly, like a slow breath drawing the mist from the earth. Chuck Norris had grown accustomed to this rhythm, the unhurried unfolding of each day. At first light, a pale orange glow seeped through the thin veil of fog that clung to the grass, and the silhouettes of fence posts stood like patient sentinels guarding the land. The air was cool enough to sting the lungs, and he liked it that way. It kept him sharp, awake, aware of the life still burning inside him. Before the sun had risen completely, Chuck was already outside. The boards of the porch creaked faintly under his boots as he stepped down into the yard. A pair of horses grazed lazily near the far fence line, their breath visible in short white bursts. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, the sound carrying easily through the open plains. He walked to the barn, his path familiar, his stride steady, as though the ranch itself had absorbed the measure of his pace over the years. Inside, the scent of hay and old wood was thick, grounding him in the present. He checked the feed, adjusted a loose hinge on a stall door, and let his hands work on instinct while his mind wandered. Training had never left his life, not even in retirement from the relentless schedules of film sets and public appearances. Out here, it was simpler. The equipment was basic: a heavy bag suspended from a reinforced beam, a wooden dummy he had built himself, and an open patch of earth where he practiced forms as the sun climbed higher. His body remembered every sequence, every shift in stance, as though no time had passed since his competition days. Each strike landed with precision. Each block carried the weight of decades of refinement. He did not train for anyone's approval now. He trained because it was as much a part of him as breathing. By mid-morning, he would usually finish his workout, cool down with a walk along the perimeter fence, and return to the house for breakfast. Life had narrowed into these quiet rituals, and he found a certain peace in that. There were no roaring crowds here, no flashing cameras, no obligations beyond the land and the animals. He had earned this stillness after years of discipline in public life. It was just before noon when the phone rang. The sound was almost jarring in the quiet house. He wiped his hands on a towel, crossed the kitchen, and answered. The voice on the other end was familiar, low, weathered, carrying the weight of years spent in the same arenas and training halls. It was Daniel Price, an old friend from the competitive circuit and later a fellow advocate for martial arts and community programs. They had not spoken in several months, but the tone in Daniel's voice was warm and direct. Daniel told him about a small city 2 states over, a place where he had been volunteering at a local martial arts center. The program, Daniel explained, was important to the community, especially to the youth. They were hosting a public exhibition in a week's time, with demonstrations planned for students of all ages. Local officials, sponsors, and townspeople would be there. It was meant to be a celebration, but Daniel hinted that there were issues. Nothing explicit, just a pause in his voice when he mentioned the head instructor, a man named Vince Gage. Vince was, according to Daniel, a decorated martial artist with a black belt and a knack for commanding attention. The center had grown under his leadership, and his face was on every banner, every flyer, every advertisement in town. Chuck listened without interrupting. He had met plenty of instructors over the years, most dedicated and honorable, some more concerned with image than substance. Daniel didn't outright criticize Vince, but the way he avoided certain details said enough. What Daniel did say was that it would mean a lot to the community if Chuck came to watch the event. He didn't have to participate, just his presence would lift spirits, lend credibility, and maybe encourage the younger students. The idea of leaving the ranch for such a trip wasn't something Chuck took lightly. He valued his solitude, the way each day unfolded without outside demands. Yet there was an undercurrent in Daniel's words that stirred something in him. Respect for Daniel played its part too. They had been through enough together to know that when one called, it was for a reason, he agreed. The decision was as straightforward as that. After hanging up, he stood for a while by the window, looking out at the stretch of land beyond the porch. It was early autumn, the season where the air carried the faintest bite, and the fields took on a deeper hue. He would need to make arrangements for the animals, ensure the ranch hand could cover in his absence. But the thought of stepping back into a world of mats and training halls, even just as a visitor, brought with it an unexpected flicker of anticipation. The days before the trip passed quickly. He packed lightly, just a duffel bag with clothes, a pair of comfortable training shoes in case he was asked to move a little, and a few personal items. The drive to the small city took him through long stretches of open road, past fields where cattle grazed, and clusters of trees stood like green islands in a golden sea. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, late afternoon sun was painting everything in a warm, slanting light. It was the kind of place where Main Street still had a diner with neon signs and a hardware store that had probably been family-owned for decades. Yet as he drove deeper into the city center, he began to notice banners strung between lampposts, posters in shop windows, all featuring the same sharp-jawed man in a black martial arts uniform, Vince Gage. The slogans beneath his image promised strength, discipline, victory. The martial arts center itself was impossible to miss. It occupied a corner building with tall glass windows that revealed glimpses of bright mats inside. Above the entrance, bold letters declared it to be the Gage Academy of Martial Excellence. Outside, a sandwich board announced the upcoming exhibition in crisp block letters. Several people milled about near the entrance. Parents with children in white uniforms, teenagers carrying gym bags, a few men in athletic jackets leaning against the wall and talking. Chuck parked a short distance away, preferring to approach without drawing attention. From across the street, he watched for a moment. The building was impressive, polished, designed to catch the eye. But the air around it carried a different energy, something more rigid than welcoming. Parents kept their conversations quiet, and the students' postures were disciplined to the point of stiffness, even outside the training hall. As he turned toward the small hotel where he had booked a room, Chuck found himself wondering just what kind of atmosphere awaited inside that building. He had come here expecting to watch, to support his friend's cause quietly, but already something in the scene before him hinted that his role in this story might not stay so simple. The morning of the exhibition came with a pale, clouded sky that promised neither rain nor full sun, just a cool stillness that hung over the small city. Chuck left the hotel after an unhurried breakfast, walking the short distance to the martial arts center with his hands in his jacket pockets. The streets were beginning to show signs of the day's event. A few cars pulled up in front of the building, letting out children in neatly pressed white uniforms, belts tied precisely at their waists. Parents hurried alongside them, some carrying bags, others clutching cameras, eager to capture the performance. As he approached the building, the bold letters above the glass doors seemed even more imposing than they had the day before. The Gage Academy of Martial Excellence had made itself the centerpiece of this block. Through the large windows, Chuck could see the mats spread in immaculate rows, a deep blue that contrasted sharply with the polished white walls. Mirrors lined one side of the training space, reflecting the bustling movement of students and instructors preparing for the morning. Trophy cases stretched along the opposite wall, filled to capacity with medals, plaques, and gleaming cups, their polished surfaces catching every bit of light. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and the synthetic material of the mats. The chatter of families and the shuffle of feet on the floor mixed with the sound of a loudspeaker crackling somewhere near the reception desk. A young woman in a branded tracksuit moved between the crowd and the front counter, checking names against a list and handing out visitor badges. Chuck stepped to one side to give her space, watching as parents leaned in to whisper questions about seating, photography, and when their children would perform. It didn't take long for him to notice the man who was clearly Vince Gage. He entered from a side door at the far end of the mat space, already wearing a crisp black jai with red trim that set him apart from every other instructor. The belt around his waist bore multiple stripes, and his movements had the deliberate ease of someone who understood the power of presence. He strode across the mats without hesitation, stopping now and then to adjust the stance of a young student or to shake hands with a parent. The exchanges seemed polite on the surface, but there was an edge to his manner, a slight upward tilt of the chin that carried an unspoken reminder of who held authority here. Chuck stayed near the back of the spectator area, content to blend into the crowd. He observed the opening sequence of the event students lined up in perfect rows, each bowing sharply when Vince gave the command. The sound of their collective movement was precise, almost militaristic. Vince addressed the audience with a voice that carried easily, polished by years of speaking to groups. He spoke of discipline, respect, and the honor of martial arts, his gaze sweeping the room as though measuring each listener's attention. The demonstrations began with the youngest students. They performed simple blocks, punches, and kicks, each movement called out by Vince. When a child's form faltered, he corrected it on the spot, sometimes with a gentle touch to the arm or shoulder, sometimes with a brisk repositioning that left the child blinking in surprise. The audience clapped at the end of each sequence, though Chuck noticed that the applause always seemed directed more toward Vince's leadership than toward the students' efforts. As the demonstrations progressed to older groups, the complexity of the techniques increased. Pairs of students sparred under Vince's watchful eye, their strikes and counters sharp but controlled. Occasionally, Vince would halt a match mid-movement, step onto the mat, and illustrate what he considered a proper execution. His corrections were technically sound, but the way he delivered them carried a certain flourish, as if the goal was to showcase his own skill rather than nurture the students. It was during one of these pauses that Vince's gaze caught on Chuck. At first it seemed incidental, a quick glance toward the back of the room. But then Vince's eyes lingered. His expression shifted subtly, curiosity and calculation mingling as he took in the man standing there. Tall, broad-shouldered, his posture relaxed yet unmistakably grounded. A flicker of recognition didn't seem to pass over Vince's face, suggesting that he didn't know exactly who he was looking at, only that he had spotted someone whose presence unsettled the careful balance of his stage. After the next round of applause, Vince stepped forward and addressed the audience again. His tone had taken on a new brightness, almost playful, though Chuck could hear the steel beneath it. Vince spoke of realism in training, of the need to understand not just form, but application. He explained that one of the best ways to show the value of technique was through live demonstration. Then, as if the thought had just occurred to him, he let his gaze sweep the spectators before settling, deliberately, on Chuck. "Sometimes," he said to the crowd, "you need a fresh partner to make the point." His smile widened as he gestured toward Chuck, inviting him, no, challenging him to join him on the mat. There was a murmur in the room, a ripple of interest as heads turned to see who had been singled out. Chuck felt dozens of eyes on him, some curious, some expectant. He stepped forward with an even stride, his hands loose at his sides. There was no sense in making a display of reluctance, nor of eagerness. On the mat, Vince greeted him with a handshake that was firm enough to communicate dominance, but not so overt as to seem hostile. He introduced Chuck to the audience as a visiting guest, someone, he said with a hint of humor, who had the look of a man who might enjoy seeing what we do here. The implication was clear. This was to be a test, a little spectacle for the crowd. Chuck's eyes moved briefly across the room, taking in the mirrors, the watching students, the parents leaning forward in their seats. He had not come here to challenge anyone, but the situation had shifted beyond the casual role of observer. Vince explained that he would demonstrate a standard self-defense technique, something any student might need if grabbed from behind. His tone made it sound like a harmless lesson, yet there was an unmistakable glint in his eye as he positioned Chuck in the center of the mat. The room was quieter now, the shuffle of feet stilled, the air thick with expectation. Chuck could feel the subtle shift in energy, the way some of the older students sat straighter, sensing that this was more than a routine drill. Vince moved into position, stepping behind him with the measured grace of someone preparing for a performance. Chuck waited, steady, as the instructor's shadow fell across him. The challenge had been set, though no one had spoken the word. Whatever Vince's intentions, this was no longer about a simple demonstration for the audience. It was about control, about proving something before a room full of people who looked to him as the embodiment of authority. Chuck understood that in moments like these, the line between display and confrontation could vanish in an instant. The mat beneath his feet felt firm and familiar. The sound of the room had faded, replaced by the slow, measured cadence of his own breathing. Vince's presence loomed just behind him. In that breathless moment before the first move, Chuck knew the quiet introduction to this place was over. The real nature of the Gage Academy and of the man who ruled it was about to reveal itself. The air in the Gage Academy seemed to compress the moment Vince shifted his stance behind Chuck. The murmur of the audience dulled into a muffled hum, as though the walls themselves had drawn closer to witness what was about to happen. Chuck kept his weight evenly distributed, his feet anchored to the mat, his breathing slow and deep. He had been on enough floors like this in his life to sense the intent of a man before he even made contact, and what radiated from Vince now was not the playful energy of a friendly demonstration. It was sharper, charged with the need to establish dominance in front of his students and patrons. Vince's arm came around in a practiced arc, his bicep pressing into one side of Chuck's neck, his forearm into the other. The pressure was precise, cutting off the flow of blood to the brain rather than crushing the windpipe. A blood choke executed cleanly. For a moment, the room might have believed they were watching a cooperative display, but the pressure didn't ease as it should have. Vince locked his grip, his body aligning in such a way that Chuck could feel the tightening across his own shoulders. The man's breathing was steady, almost leisurely, his weight settling into the hold as though to prove a point. To anyone without training, the sensation might have been alarming, the edges of vision beginning to shimmer and fade. But Chuck allowed his body to absorb it, muscles neither rigid nor limp. Mind settled in the calm space that came from years of both giving and escaping such holds. He noted the subtle overcommitment of Vince's forward stance, the angle of his hips, the tension in his grip that betrayed the underlying strain of holding a man his size. The audience's expressions were varied. Some of the younger students looked confused, glancing toward their parents as if to ask whether this was still part of the show. The older ones kept their eyes locked on Vince, waiting for the inevitable moment when he would release and declare victory. Yet that moment did not come. The seconds stretched. Chuck could sense the faint shift in the mood of the crowd and concern creeping in at the edges, though no one moved to intervene. Vince's voice carried just enough for the first two rows to hear, a low explanation about how attackers on the street wouldn't give you the courtesy of an easy escape. He tightened the choke another fraction, and Chuck felt the subtle quickening of his pulse against the compressing muscles. The instructor was no longer demonstrating, he was testing. It was a test that assumed compliance, that counted on Chuck yielding before an audience that expected to see their leader unshaken. In the space of a breath, Chuck made his choice. His body dropped its weight suddenly, forcing Vince's stance to adjust. In that instant of recalibration, Chuck shifted his center of gravity, his hips turning just enough to create a sliver of space between his neck and Vince's arm. His elbow drove backward into the precise point below Vince's sternum. Not with reckless force, but with the kind of accuracy that instantly disrupted the man's breathing rhythm. The grip loosened, barely, but enough. What followed happened so quickly that the onlookers could only register it in fragments. Chuck's torso rotated, his hands finding the fabric of Vince's GI in a grip honed by countless repetitions over decades. The pivot of his hips was smooth, economical, and Vince's body rose just slightly before momentum carried him over Chuck's side. The throw landed him flat on the mat with a solid, echoing thud. The sound cut through the room's murmur like a clap of thunder. Vince lay on his side for a heartbeat, the air knocked from his lungs, eyes wide with disbelief. Chuck stood over him, posture composed, hands relaxed, as if ready to help him up. But Vince's pride seemed to hold him down as much as the impact had. The silence in the room was total now. Students stared with mouths slightly open. Parents exchanged quick glances. The unspoken rules of the space had shifted in an instant. The man who commanded their fear and admiration had been placed on the mat with such controlled efficiency that it was impossible to frame it as anything but a decisive reversal. Chuck gave a small nod, stepping back to allow Vince the space to recover. There was no gloating in his expression, no triumphal gesture, only the calm of someone who had simply reacted as necessary. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the edge of the mat, leaving Vince to collect himself in the center of the room. As he stepped off the mats, Chuck felt the weight of dozens of eyes following him. Some were wide with respect, others narrowed in suspicion, but all of them carried the imprint of what they had just witnessed. He returned to the back of the spectator area, reclaiming his quiet stance against the wall. The event stumbled forward, Vince regaining his footing and moving on to the next group of students with a stiffness that betrayed the effort it took to keep his composure. The rest of the exhibition passed in a muted blur. Chuck's attention was less on the techniques being performed now and more on the undercurrents in the room, the sidelong glances between older students, the guarded expressions of a few parents, the way Vince's corrections grew sharper and more abrupt. The performance had lost its smoothness, the rhythm disrupted by the moment when control had slipped from his grasp. When the demonstrations concluded and the audience began to disperse, Chuck stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. The coolness was a welcome contrast to the charged atmosphere inside. He made his way down the street toward the hotel, the sound of the event still faintly audible behind him. That evening, in the quiet of his room, Chuck sat in the single armchair by the window. He replayed the scene in his mind, not out of pride, but with the analytical eye that had guided him through a lifetime in martial arts. The hold had been deliberate, prolonged past the point of instruction. It had been an attempt not to teach, but to diminish. That alone was enough to leave him unsettled, but there was more. He had seen the way some of the students watched Vince, the rigid discipline that bordered on intimidation. There had been no laughter in that room, no ease even in the youngest children. Martial arts demanded respect. Yes, but respect was earned, not enforced through fear. As the lights from the street lamps cast long, thin shadows across the floor, Chuck recognized the feeling building in his chest. He had come here intending only to observe, to support a friend, but the events of the day had altered that path. There was something beneath the polished surface of the Gage Academy that he could not ignore, and the quiet moment on the mat had been only the first glimpse of it. When he finally switched off the lamp and lay down, the decision was not yet fully formed, but the direction was clear. He would see more before he left this town. Whatever Vince Gage was building in that academy, it was time to understand its true foundation. The next morning dawned cool and still, the kind of weather that lent itself to clear thought. Chuck woke early, more out of habit than necessity, and found himself replaying the previous day's events in his mind. The sharp thud of Vince hitting the mat still resonated, not as a point of pride, but as a catalyst. It had shifted something between Vince and himself, between Vince and the audience, and perhaps within the academy itself. The precision and control with which Chuck had countered the chokehold had not been meant as a challenge, but he knew it had landed as one, and Vince would not soon forget the humiliation. He went downstairs to the small hotel dining area, where the scent of brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of toast. He ate without hurry, watching the street outside through a large window. The town was beginning to stir. A pair of delivery trucks idled in front of a bakery. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors, and a few early risers walked briskly toward their morning destinations. Somewhere a block away, the distinctive front of the Gage Academy came into view whenever the angle of the street allowed it. The sight anchored his thoughts to the undercurrent he'd sensed inside an atmosphere that felt more controlled than supportive, more like a command than a partnership between teacher and student. By mid-morning, Chuck decided to take a walk toward the academy, not to confront Vince, but to see it in a different light. The street was quieter than it had been during the exhibition. Through the tall glass windows, he saw small groups of students scattered across the mats. They were drilling basic techniques under the watchful eye of an assistant instructor. Vince was nowhere in sight. Chuck entered without drawing attention, greeting the receptionist with a polite nod. She seemed to hesitate for half a second before returning the nod, as if she recognized him from the day before, and wasn't quite sure how to respond. The assistant instructor, a younger man in a white gi with a brown belt, led the students through repetitive drills. His voice was firm but lacked the edge Chuck had heard in Vince's. Even so, there was little room for conversation or spontaneity. The atmosphere remained rigid. When a boy of about 12 stumbled through a sequence, the instructor barked at him to start over and made him repeat the move until his shoulders trembled. The boy's eyes stayed fixed on the floor, avoiding any glance toward his peers. Chuck stood at the side, observing. There was discipline here, yes, but it was paired with a sort of constant tension. He thought back to his own early training, how his instructors had demanded precision, but balanced it with encouragement, how laughter was not forbidden, but earned through shared effort. What he saw here was a sharp contrast. Students who seemed to be performing for approval rather than learning for themselves. When the class ended, Chuck stepped outside into the cool air again. He didn't have to search far before an older man approached him from across the street. The man wore a faded ball cap and carried himself with the gait of someone used to hard work. He introduced himself quietly as a parent of one of the academy's students and said he had seen the incident with Vince. His tone was cautious, his eyes darting briefly toward the academy before returning to Chuck. He spoke in measured phrases, explaining that Vince's methods had become increasingly harsh over the past year. His son had once loved training, but lately had grown withdrawn and nervous before classes. There were no obvious injuries, but there was a change in his demeanor that the father could not ignore. Chuck listened without interrupting. The man's words confirmed what he had suspected, that the edge in Vince's instruction was not limited to him or to demonstrations in front of a crowd. Before they parted, the man glanced around again and suggested Chuck talk to a few other parents who had begun to harbor doubts. Over the next 2 days, Chuck quietly attended more sessions, blending into the background. He noticed patterns, the way Vince would single out certain students for extended drills, pushing them past the point of fatigue, the way praise was rare and usually delivered with a hint of condescension, the way students carried themselves outside the building, their postures stiff, their eyes cast downward. He also saw how parents lingered after drop-off, not in casual conversation but in uneasy waiting, as if they wanted to be close in case something went wrong. It wasn't only the students who felt the weight of Vince's authority. Assistant instructors deferred to him in a way that went beyond respect. Their corrections mimicked his style, and they rarely deviated from his directives, even in small matters. It spoke of an environment where questioning the leader's approach was discouraged, perhaps even punished. Late one afternoon, Chuck met with Daniel in a quiet corner of a small diner. The place smelled of fried food and coffee, its vinyl booths cracked with age. Daniel had been cautious from the start, but now his caution had deepened into outright concern. He admitted that he had avoided telling Chuck everything before the exhibition, hoping the event might simply pass without incident. But seeing Vince push that chokehold past the point of instruction had convinced him that silence was no longer the wiser course. Daniel explained that Vince had built strong connections with local officials, partly through the Academy's success in regional tournaments and partly through community programs that claimed to mentor troubled youth. On paper, it was all commendable free classes for underprivileged kids, discipline through martial arts, guidance away from bad influences. But Daniel had heard whispers that these programs were less about guidance and more about control, with Vince enforcing his methods under the protection of those who valued his results more than the well-being of the participants. Chuck left the diner with a slow-burning certainty forming in his mind. The pattern was clear. Vince's authority was not limited to the walls of the academy. It extended into the community, supported by a network that likely saw him as an asset. Challenging that would not be simple. It would require more than a single confrontation or a display of skill. It would require proof, the kind that could not be brushed aside by charm or influence. That night, Chuck sat at the small desk in his hotel room, a notepad in front of him. He began listing what he had seen, what he had been told, and what needed further investigation. The list grew quickly: names of parents, times of classes, observations about specific incidents, connections between the academy and local programs. His handwriting was steady, each line a step toward understanding the full scope of Vince's hold over his students and the community. The decision to act was no longer in question. What remained was the method. Chuck knew better than to rush in without preparation. If Vince had cultivated allies in high places, then exposing him would take precision, timing, and a foundation of evidence that could withstand scrutiny. He also knew that the longer he stayed, the more Vince would see him as a threat, which meant the window for gathering information might be narrower than he'd like. When he set the pen down, the notepad was filled with dense lines of notes and a tentative plan. He leaned back, the hum of distant traffic filtering through the window. The quiet life he had left on the ranch felt far away now. Here the air was thick with tension, the kind that settled into the bones of those who lived under it. He had seen enough to know that the Gage Academy's glossy exterior concealed something darker, and he was not about to leave without finding out exactly what it was. Morning would bring another chance to observe, another chance to connect with those willing to speak, and perhaps, if he was careful, it would bring the first piece of undeniable proof that Vince Gage's empire was not built on excellence, but on control and fear. The following days unfolded with a quiet intensity, each one marked by small but deliberate steps forward. Chuck knew the difference between rushing into a fight and preparing for one. Here, preparation meant listening more than speaking, watching more than acting. Vince Gage's influence was thick in the air, like humidity before a storm, clinging to the town in ways that weren't immediately visible but could be felt in every guarded glance and hesitant word. Chuck began by revisiting the parents who had been willing to talk. It wasn't easy. Many were reluctant to speak twice, afraid of what might happen if word got back to Vince. Some looked over their shoulders before inviting him inside. Others insisted on meeting in out-of-the-way spots like empty park benches or quiet corners of coffee shops. The stories shared were rarely dramatic in the way that made headlines, but they were consistent. Students who loved martial arts began to fear the mat. Praise was scarce, mistakes punished with drills that bordered on excessive, and the line between discipline and domination was blurred until no one was quite sure where it lay. He listened without interruption, taking careful mental notes. Parents spoke about their children's sudden changes, loss of confidence, tension in their shoulders, quiet dinners where the only topic avoided was training. They spoke, too, of the times they tried to question Vince directly, only to be met with a calm but unyielding wall of words that framed his methods as necessary for building champions. When they left his office, they often felt more uncertain than before, as though they were the ones failing their children by doubting him. Chuck recognized the pattern. He'd seen it in other forms over the years, in gyms where the culture prioritized winning above learning, in dojos where rank meant more than respect, in leaders who equated control with success. Vince wasn't unique in that regard, but he was skilled in making his version of it look respectable. The trophies, the tournament photos on the wall, the community outreach programs, all of it formed a veneer so polished that it blinded outsiders to what lay beneath. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the streetlights began to glow, Chuck found himself walking the length of Main Street, thinking about the best way to pierce that veneer. Direct confrontation inside the academy would be dramatic, but without proof, it would be just his word against Vince's, and Vince had home advantage. What was needed was an audience, one that Vince couldn't control, one that would force him to drop the mask or risk exposing himself. The opportunity presented itself sooner than Chuck expected. Daniel approached him the next morning with news of an upcoming public seminar the academy was hosting. It was to be held in the town's recreation center, a larger space that could accommodate parents, students, and local officials. On the surface, it was meant to showcase the academy's skill and to promote a new community program for at-risk youth. In reality, Chuck suspected it would also be a stage for Vince to reassert dominance after the embarrassment of the exhibition. Chuck agreed to attend, but he didn't tell Daniel the full extent of his intentions. Instead, he began preparing in his own way. He reached out to a handful of the parents who had been most open with him and asked if they would be willing to speak quietly to others who might share their concerns. He suggested they attend the seminar, not just as spectators, but as observers ready to notice the details, how Vince treated his students, what he said when challenged, whether the public face matched the private experience. In the days leading up to the event, Chuck made himself visible at the academy without being intrusive. He watched classes from the side, offering small words of encouragement to students during breaks. Nothing overt enough to draw Vince's ire, but enough to remind the kids that there was another way to approach training. Some responded with shy smiles, others with puzzled looks, as though they couldn't quite reconcile the calm presence of this visitor with the man they had seen handle their instructor so effortlessly. Vince himself remained outwardly polite but distant. His greetings to Chuck were brief, his eyes measuring, his body language closed. Chuck could almost see the calculations running behind those eyes, the weighing of risks, the assessment of whether this older man was a temporary disruption or a more permanent problem. If Vince suspected the latter, he gave no sign, but the stiffness in his tone made it clear that he had not forgotten the mat. The night before the seminar, Chuck sat in his hotel room, the notepad from earlier now filled with tightly written pages. He reviewed his observations, the accounts from parents, and his own impressions. He knew he wouldn't be able to lay it all out at once, but the goal wasn't to overwhelm. It was to shift the perspective of those who had been conditioned to see Vince as unassailable. A seed of doubt planted in the right moment could grow into something Vince couldn't control. When the day arrived, the recreation center was already bustling by the time Chuck arrived. Rows of folding chairs faced a large matted area where the demonstrations would take place. Parents chatted in small clusters, students in crisp uniforms stretched and warmed up, and local officials mingled near a refreshments table. Vince moved easily through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling for photographs, radiating the kind of confidence that came from knowing the room was his. Chuck found a seat near the front, not hiding but not drawing attention either. He watched as the seminar began. The first demonstrations, a series of well-rehearsed routines showcasing speed, precision, and control. The crowd applauded at all the right moments. Vince narrated with practiced ease, explaining techniques in a way that made even the uninitiated feel included. It was a performance, and he was good at it. Then came the segment that Chuck had been waiting for, the real-world application portion, where Vince invited volunteers to participate in controlled scenarios. Predictably, he called on one of his senior students first, demonstrating a clean takedown and a quick release. The applause was steady, the smiles unbroken. Then Vince's gaze swept the crowd, and his eyes landed on Chuck. The pause was brief but telling. "Mr. Norris," Vince said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to mask the challenge beneath. "Perhaps you'd like to join us again? The crowd would certainly enjoy seeing you in action." Chuck stood slowly, making his way to the mat. The air seemed to tighten with anticipation. Vince explained that he would demonstrate a series of holds and escapes, asking Chuck to react as he saw fit. The first few were harmless enough. A wrist grab here, a shoulder lock there, each executed cleanly, with Chuck countering smoothly and without force. But as the sequence progressed, Vince's holds became sharper, the pressure more insistent, as though he couldn't resist the urge to reassert his dominance. Chuck met each one with the same calm precision, never escalating, but never yielding. The murmurs in the crowd grew as it became clear that Vince's efforts to unsettle him were failing. At last, Vince moved into the chokehold, the same one from the exhibition, applied with just a fraction more force than necessary. This time, Chuck allowed it to settle for a heartbeat before shifting his weight, trapping Vince's arm, and executing a flawless reversal that ended with Vince immobilized on the mat, his breathing quick and shallow, but unhurt. The silence that followed was not the stunned hush of the exhibition. It was something heavier, threaded with realization. Chuck released Vince and stepped back, offering him the chance to recover with dignity. He didn't gloat, didn't speak. The message was in the control, in the fact that the hold had been broken without malice, without injury, but without compromise. When the seminar resumed, the energy in the room had shifted. Parents watched more closely. Students whispered to each other, and Vince, though still composed, no longer commanded the same unchallenged space he had at the start. The seed had been planted. Chuck could feel it in the air. That night, as he left the recreation center, the cool breeze carried the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to find two parents approaching hesitantly, glancing around before speaking. Their words were quiet but urgent. They had seen enough, they said, and they wanted to help. Chuck nodded, already knowing that the next step would be the most decisive. The turning point had come, and from here, there would be no going back. The night after the seminar was restless for Chuck, but not because of uncertainty. His path was clear now, shaped by the quiet conversations that followed the event. The two parents who had approached him outside the recreation center were not the only ones ready to act. Word had spread quickly in small circles, carried on phone calls and hushed kitchen table talks, weaving together a network of people who had all seen the same truth. Vince Gage's grip on their children was no longer unshakable. By morning, Chuck had arranged to meet with several of them in a modest community room above a hardware store on the edge of town. The space was unremarkable wood-paneled walls, a faint smell of coffee lingering from past gatherings, but it provided the privacy they needed. One by one, parents and former students filed in, some avoiding eye contact at first, others clasping each other's shoulders in quiet solidarity. There were more than a dozen people in the room when the meeting began, and as the door closed, the air carried both tension and relief. They spoke in turns. Stories poured out, accounts of excessive training sessions that left kids limping, verbal tirades aimed at breaking their spirit, and in some cases, physical holds applied long past the point of instruction. A former student in his early 20s described the way Vince would single out those who questioned him, using them as demonstrations for painful techniques until they either stopped asking questions or left entirely. Another woman recounted the day her daughter came home in tears, her uniform collar stretched from being yanked repeatedly during a sparring match that Vince had called discipline. Chuck listened carefully, not interrupting unless to clarify a detail. The accounts formed a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. More importantly, several people had saved messages, training schedules, and even small pieces of evidence that, together, painted a clear picture of systemic abuse masked as martial discipline. The group's voices grew steadier as they realized they were not isolated cases, but part of something larger. When the stories had been told, Chuck outlined the next steps. The upcoming town council meeting, scheduled for later that week, would be the moment to bring these truths into the open. Vince's academy received funding from the town's youth outreach budget, and the council prided itself on transparency. If the evidence was presented clearly in the presence of parents, students, and local media, Vince would be forced to answer in a way he couldn't control. The plan took shape quickly. Chuck would speak, not as an accuser seeking personal retribution, but as a witness to the harm being done. The parents would provide their own testimonies, bolstered by the documented evidence. Several agreed to contact reporters in nearby cities, knowing that outside attention would make it harder for the council to bury the issue. It wasn't a fight in the traditional sense, but Chuck understood that some battles were won by shifting the ground beneath the opponent's feet. The days leading to the meeting were marked by quiet activity. Vince seemed to sense that something was brewing. His demeanor at the academy was sharper, his greetings curt. More than once, Chuck caught him scanning the room during class, as if counting which parents were watching. Yet Vince continued his usual public charm, smiling in photographs for the Academy's social media page, posting about community building and discipline as a gift. When the night of the council meeting arrived, the small government building was already filled beyond capacity. Parents lined the walls, students sat shoulder to shoulder in the back rows, and camera crews adjusted their tripods in the narrow aisles. Vince arrived in a dark suit, the picture of professionalism, his smile fixed as he shook hands with two council members before taking a seat near the front. Chuck entered quietly, making his way to the speaker's table when his name was called. The low murmur of the room faded into silence as he began to speak. His words were measured, steady, recounting the events he had witnessed since arriving in town, the exhibition match, the seminar, the patterns he had observed in Vince's behavior. He didn't raise his voice or lean on theatrics. Instead, he let the facts stand on their own, the weight of each one settling into the room like a slow, inevitable truth. When Chuck finished, the first parent stepped forward. Her voice trembled at first, but as she described her child's fear of returning to class, her tone hardened. She was followed by another, then another, until the council chambers echoed with a chorus of testimonies. Videos were shown on a projector, each frame eroding the polished image Vince had cultivated. Gasps rippled through the crowd when a clip displayed Vince holding a young student in a choke far longer than necessary. The boy's face reddening as Vince grinned for the watching class. Vince's turn to respond came at last. He stood still composed and began to speak of discipline, tradition, and the demands of competitive training. But the charm that had once carried him faltered under the weight of the evidence. Every polished phrase rang hollow in the air, thick with first-hand accounts. Council members exchanged glances, their earlier cordiality now replaced with concern and calculation. The moment of collapse came unexpectedly. A young man in his late teens stood from the back row without being called, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He introduced himself as a former student who had left the academy after an injury Vince had dismissed as weakness. His words were simple but unshakable. He teaches fear, not respect. The silence that followed was deeper than any applause could have been. The council chairwoman spoke firmly, announcing that all funding to Vince's programs was suspended pending a full investigation. The decision was met with a swell of quiet relief from the parents, though no one celebrated openly. Vince stood stiffly, his smile gone, his eyes darting as the reality settled in. He left the chamber without a word, the crowd parting silently to let him pass. In the weeks that followed, the investigation deepened. More students came forward, some from years past, adding their voices to the record. Vince's academy closed its doors within the month, the building's windows going dark, the sign above the entrance eventually removed. Chuck stayed in town long enough to see the first practice at the new community dojo. It wasn't flashy, just a rented gym space with mats laid out and a circle of kids laughing as they tried their first drills. Several of the parents from the meeting were there, along with Daniel, who had taken on the role of instructor. Chuck watched from the sidelines, offering quiet corrections when asked, content to let the space belong to those who had earned it. As the class ended and the children bowed out, Daniel approached with a grin. "You're sticking around, right?" he asked. Chuck glanced at the open floor, at the bright faces now free of the tension he'd seen weeks before. He shook his head with a faint smile. "Not this time," he said, heading toward the door. "But you've got this." Outside, the evening air was cool, the street quiet. Chuck walked without hurry, his steps carrying him toward the next town, the next challenge. Vince Gage's hold had been broken, not by a single throw or choke, but by something far stronger. The truth once spoken had done what no technique could. It had set people free. Subscribe for more stories like this, watch our next videos, and share this one with your friends.